Well, let me maybe start in the interim, and I think that the context we are acutely aware of the general context. Obviously, a continent already with 1.4 billion inhabitants, expected to grow to over 2 billion by 2040. Yet at the same time, we still have close to 600 million Africans without access to electricity. And the sad thing is that despite all the efforts that we have collectively been undertaken over the last decade, in absolute terms, that number has not changed really. Already a decade ago, in the context of sustainable energy for all, SDG 7, we were talking about close to 600 million Africans without access to electricity. There's obviously been tremendous progress in terms of the percentages, but in absolute terms, we still face a significant challenge. And that situation is even looking more daunting if we look at access to clean cooking solutions, where we have close to 1 billion Africans without access to clean cooking solutions, with all the negative impacts in terms of health, particularly for women and children, also impacting, of course, gender empowerment, having impacts on climate change through deforestation. And that's really sort of the paradox, because at the same time, obviously, the continent is endowed with some of the best resources, particularly on renewables. Solar across the entire continent, wind across coastlines, even some parts of the interior, geothermal along the East African Rift Valley, hydro, particularly in Central Africa. And you see that only a fraction of global investments in renewables are this far coming to Africa. So that's really the backdrop for Mission 300. It is a joint initiative between the World Bank Group and the African Development Bank. And I would like to emphasize this because I think it's the first time that I see the two institutions really joining forces systematically. We have meetings, discussions with the World Bank on a weekly basis at different levels. So it's really, I think, in line with the ambition of MDBs working together as a system. And that's really what makes Mission 300 different to, I would say, other efforts that have taken place in the past on the continent. While it's led by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, it is sort of meant to be a partnership. So we have already from the get-go been getting a lot of support from philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, Sustainable Energy for All. But we've also been able, in the meantime, to bring together a broad coalition of partners. And this broad coalition needs to include other development finance institutions. It needs to include the private sector as to play a key role, but it also needs to include the civil society actors in order to ensure that this is really an inclusive process. The objective of Mission 300 is obvious. It is to provide access to 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030. But I would really like to emphasize that here, the expectation is that in 2030, we can verify these 300 million people who have gotten access as a result of Mission 300. So it's not kind of expected access, it is actual access. Talk about 300 million actual access, that means two things. One is from the bank side, so the bank's side, we need to ensure that we deliver on the projects that we've already approved. There are quite a number of projects that have been approved over recent years, but they have not delivered the impact yet in terms of the access outcomes. So one part is really how can we accelerate our portfolio of operations that we have already approved. But that's only getting us to a certain point. So the next part is how can we now accelerate, approve additional financing for new projects over the next 2 to 3 years to get us to the target of 300 million connections. Because realistically, anything that we approve after 2028 will not deliver access by 2030. But I think what is really important about the Dar es Salaam Declaration is that it's a commitment from African countries at the highest level to undertake the required reforms to achieve the ambition of Mission 300. So it's really a reform commitment more than anything else. It's also a declaration that was subsequently endorsed by the African Union at the February AU Heads of State Summit. Obviously, Mission 300 and 300 million will only get us halfway towards the challenge. So it really requires others to step up as well, so that we can really make a significant dent towards addressing the overall access deficit.
Last year, at the Africa Heads of State Summit, on the sidelines of that event, we launched what we refer to as the 630 campaign, and it was really a Pan-African push to power the 630 million people without electricity on the continent. The numbers varies depending on who you're talking to, 600 million, 630 million, 650 million. But 630 was quite symbolic for us, and so we decided to name the campaign the 630 campaign, which we thought if you were going to invest $1,000 for everyone without electricity on the continent, that amounts to about $630 billion. Quite ambitious, but if you had to provide 100% electricity access on the continent, you need to think about everyone without access to electricity. And there are a number of central objectives of the campaign. The first one is that the campaign really seeks to mobilize commitments, secure substantial financial commitment to invest in renewable energy access, especially for last mile communities. But also the campaign believes that access should be driven by renewable energies for obvious reasons, as we are doing things within a context that is being constrained by climate change. And so not only thinking about energy access in terms of meeting emission reduction metrics, but particularly and in response to the specific context of the continent to enhance resilience and adaptive capacities, because we find that there is a very strong relationship between the capacities of communities to adapt and the energy poverty that exists in those communities. And of course, as a byproduct of that, contribute to the reduction of emissions, especially by promoting a shift away from fossil fuels, and kind of long-term impact level goal being that there is socioeconomic growth that is sustainable, both in terms of economic metrics, but also environmental and social metrics. And so to achieve that goal, the campaign focuses on a number of strategies. The first one is donor engagement and advocacy, which is part of the work we are doing with the African Development Bank through the Civil Society Coalition. And the idea here is to build partnerships with all those who are involved to secure commitments. And again, we're so glad that Mission 300 appears to be moving in that direction in terms of how much they're putting forward to be able to meet the challenges of energy access. But there's also a core component which is around capacity building and knowledge sharing to equip stakeholders with tools and knowledge for effective renewable energy advocacy and deployment. And there is the need to mobilize and move. And we've had a number of engagements with some civil society actors to be able to see how we can broaden the number of actors that are trying to advance this agenda. And of course, there is also need to demonstrate that this works through implementation of pilot programs and projects. So there's a very simple hypothesis, which starts with acknowledging that Mission 300, the goal is quite ambitious. I think the good thing for us and that we see is that a success is measured in terms of the number of people who have access rather than in terms of installed capacity. That's an important distinction that we made very quickly and found that a little more useful in terms of being able to measure the impact of Mission 300. However, we think that cannot be very possible if there's a lack of civil society engagement, and the lack of it, there is mention throughout the documentation on Mission 300 about consultations, involvement of civil society, but there's really no structured, deliberate attempt to make the civil society or communities part of the process. And that presents a number of risks. I'm going to just name three of them, which is that of lack of legitimacy. It looks like top-down imposed initiative, but there is also the chances that the impacts may not be what is expected, and that the justice dimensions of these issues may not be taken into account. And our argument, central argument, is that people's first participation shouldn't be optional, it should be foundational. So we propose a 4-pillar framework through which we think civil society organizations can be embedded in Mission 300. The first pillar is around governance and representation. And we make at this point some very concrete proposals, which I think will form a part of the deliberations as we go ahead. In terms of establishing a Mission 300 Civil Society Advisory Council, we think that could help embed, ensure that CSOs are represented in governing bodies of Mission 300, whether it's in terms of steering committees or technical working groups, but also institutionalizing periodic high-level dialogues between CSOs, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and all of those driving it. There's a second pillar, which is around programmatic co-implementation, because we think that, as you would discover, the level of technical knowledge within the civil society has grown. We were having a conversation the other day, and it took a while to say, look, we need to stop conceptualizing civil society as activists. Not every civil society organization is in activism. They're organizations that are actually driving innovations and providing solutions with solid research that can help solve some of the problems that we have. And co-implementation could be a way to harness all of that. But more critically, we think that civil society is going to be useful in terms of providing CSO-led citizen audits. And what we highlight here is the need for what we call community-defined success indicators, so that success is not understood only in terms of how those who initiated Mission 300 thought about it, but also in terms of how communities perceive it. And finally, in terms of advocacy and capacity building, to provide a number of opportunities, for example, to fund capacity building, of course, for CSOs, but integrate CSOs into national energy compact development and review processes, and also create CSO-led research platforms to inform policy and innovation.
All of us know that Africa have 49% of the potential energy of the whole world, of the potential renewable energy, 60% of the solar energy. How we are able to invest in this energy to be accessible, to be affordable for the women at the grassroots, for everybody. Think in Africa, it's the most global, it's expensive. I think per kilowatt is 0.30 compared to the global is 0.13 cent, which is actually huge difference with reference to accessibility. So how are we, under Africa Business Council, we already created a cluster for energy, for green economy, for blue economy, where we bring together all the active players within the energy sector from the private sector. But how are we going with Mission 300? How does Mission 300 really taps into the potentials of African resources with reference to renewable energy? How we build the capacity of our women and youth entrepreneurs to be actually energy provider and not only energy consumers? How we are able to invest in the human resources and the potentials, as my brother have said with Mama Samia Suluhu. She already, during the Congress, she just made an initiative for clean cooking. You know, it's a huge issue with reference to clean cooking on the continent. But for us as private sector, it is very important, again, that business organization could be part of the Mission 300, exactly like the non-state actors, because the voice of the private sector is very important to invest into renewable energy, to invest in clean energy. And it's very also important to understand the dynamics with reference to why women should walk kilometers to bring firewood, while we are able to have this 300 mission accessible for them. So I believe it's very important to have blending financing, to have building capacity of our women and youth entrepreneurs, to see how we have advocacy again and outreach and awareness. I'm sure this 300 mission, Daniel, we know it among us here, but all the private sector in the continent, non-state actors, they are not aware about it because there is no, again, an awareness campaign, an outreach for the private sector to reach out to the real players on the ground and to reach the grassroots. I mean, it's really not about empowering the grid. It's about empowering the people who are there. And energy is only a catalyst and utility for trade and industrialization. So we need again to empower our people to have local value change, to manufacturing even of the batteries, manufacturing of all the solar panels. How we empower our people to have. Why do we bring solar panels from China? It's not possible. We have all the ingredients on the ground. So again, Mission 300 should be a justice. It's a right. Energy is a right. It's not only access to energy. So the whole mission is to leave nobody behind, is to empower our African private sector to industrialize and invest in renewable energy and in local manufacturing with reference to solar panels, all the machineries that goes with solar, cooking stoves and lithium batteries. I mean, we have already, again, all the critical minerals of the continent that we are not using, but we are exporting it as raw materials. How we empower our African private sector to industrialize on the continent, to make energy affordable. 600 million people out of electricity, and Mission 300 is halfway, as we said, and the 630 again campaign is about how we empower our people. So really, it's really not about empowering homes, it's about empowering hopes, how our people of Africa have an impact on their daily life.
Could you just speak to the issue of civil society accountability and monitoring?
Civil society coming into this discussion, we are talking to Mission. We are talking about partnerships with Mission 300. Eugene has set a very good ground when he was talking about us being a part of these discussions. Some of these things that we are talking about, as we talk about moving away from non-renewable energy and talking about natural gas as a transition energy. This is a discussion that we as civil society want to bring back to the table, that we are talking about movement to non-renewable, from non-renewables to the renewables, and that we still have a discussion around the natural energy. There's a discussion around the false alternatives. Now, Mission 300 brings a lot of a discussion around the renewable energies to the extent that solar, geothermal, hydro are all coming in to better the lives of the people and to bring the energy. But we are seeing a trend where the violations that were happening with the renewables, with the non-renewables, are still the violations that are coming with the renewables now. We are still seeing solar projects, geothermal projects. We are still seeing hydro projects that are affecting the people in a grand way, that are talking about dispossession of land, that are damming rivers, that are causing pollution. And we are saying that coming into this discussion as civil society, we want to go back to that table with you, like Eugene has suggested, when you are developing these projects, as you are rolling out these projects, to talk about our input into the rollout of these projects and the implementation of these projects, because there we are having all these experiences and there's something that we can provide to these discussions. The other thing maybe is the improvement in the documentation of community consultation processes. You heard the private sector speak, you're listening to us speak, you're listening to the communities who are the major constituents. And in as much as it comes off as a top-down, the legitimacy gets into question. And that's a major thing that we are talking about here. But also lastly, when you are talking about the financing aspect of it, shifting from the very loan-heavy financing, which is the loans that come from the private sector. We know that as the Africa Development Bank and the financing architecture is now tilted to tapping into the private funds, the private capital. And with that tapping into the private capital comes the issue of debt on one part as our countries, because then they're offering Private capital doesn't really go into grants. It doesn't really go much into concessional loans. So we are having that discussion around that. How are we going to mobilize the little public finance that we are having? How are we going to have this discussion with you to mobilize this to go into grants and concessional financing for the energy? Because then if we're falling to the date, then it becomes worse for us as states. But also, it also gives the overburdening hand of private capital onto the energy discussion, which we do not want, both as states, but also as civil society getting into these discussions. At RICOS, we are having these discussions, and the Africa Finance Campaigner for RICOS, we are having these discussions, and we hope to further them with the Mission 300 team.
We need to be a little more audacious in our approach. And something that Daniel spoke about, and you, Eugene, also have said, is the fact that we're slowly coming out of the traditional approach of looking at success in this energy discourse, being installed capacity, moving towards access, okay? Because we could have big installed capacity, but that doesn't resonate with the person in the last mile. So just the fact that the AFDB and the World Bank are taking this approach, where we could say this is a positive step. But we have to move a little more further. And I was thrilled by the intervention of my sister, Dr. Amami. So far, we've had this public-private partnerships as a modus operandi in these energy or investment discussions. What the coalition and its partners are proposing, we should go beyond that and have public-private community partnerships. That's where issues like this can come in. That's the window. Okay? And if you look, ladies and gentlemen, if you look, there was a study that was done a couple of years ago, an assessment of renewable energy initiatives on this continent for the last decade. There were more than 58. When you look around, is it a continent that has 58 renewable energy or more than 58 renewable energy initiatives? So what is wrong? The problem is governance. Let's think out of the box. And the coalition is in a better place, working with the bank for the people and bringing along other partners that are not necessarily in the coalition, getting their own ideas to make this work. I believe that if we use this approach, Mission 300 will not only be daring, it will be successful because it comes with the people in mind. Then lastly, Eugene, let's just take an instance where John talked about having renewable energy initiatives or projects that still do more harm to the people than good. If, for instance, a project comes to a community, the people give 5 hectares of their land, they sacrifice 5 hectares of their land. Instead of being compensated for that land, they turn it into the equity of that community in that project. You know what? The community will see a long-term interest in keeping that project. You will not have to bring guards from elsewhere to protect the solar panels because it is their project. At that time, the investor is winning. The community is winning because they are stakeholders, not passive stakeholders. These are the kind of ideas and approach that the coalition is bringing into this, this discourse.